The Cost of Ambition. Richard Calloway was a man who had rewritten his destiny. From a modest upbringing in the outskirts of Brooklyn, he had climbed the unrelenting corporate ladder to become one of the most influential businessmen in the world. The skyscrapers of Manhattan bore witness to his conquests, his name whispered in boardrooms as the epitome of strategic brilliance and ruthless ambition. But as he stood in his corner office, gazing out at the city skyline, something gnawed at him. The empire he had built, the billions he had amassed, the respect he commanded. They all felt hollow in the quiet moments, in the spaces where laughter and love should have resided. His assistant's voice cut through the intercom, as precise and clipped as ever. "Mr. Calloway, your 9 o'clock is here." Richard straightened his tie, pushing the intrusive thoughts aside. "Send them in." The door opened, revealing a young executive clutching a portfolio, as if his life depended on it. The kid's nervous energy was almost palpable. "Mr. Calloway, the quarterly reports are in." "We exceeded projections by 15%. Richard interrupted, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. The executive blinked, astonished. "Yes, sir. How did you?" "I always know," Richard said smoothly, leaning back in his chair, exuding the effortless confidence that made him legendary in the industry. "The market shifts, the numbers dance. I feel it in my bones before the reports ever land on my desk." The executive nodded hurriedly, fumbling with his papers. Richard waved him off with a flick of his wrist. "That'll be all. Make sure the board knows I expect 20% next quarter." As the young man scurried out, Richard let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. The thrill of winning, of outmaneuvering competitors, no longer set his blood on fire the way it used to. The high was fleeting, leaving behind a stark emptiness he couldn't shake. Just as he reached for his coffee, the intercom crackled again. "Sir, your wife is here." A pause. "She's insisting on seeing you." A flicker of irritation passed over Richard's face. Alina rarely demanded his time anymore, not since she'd stopped trying to fight for a place in his ever-expanding world. He took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the bitterness before replying. "Send her in." The door opened, and Alina Calloway stepped inside, her presence commanding despite her small frame. She was as breathtaking as ever, long auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, eyes a shade of green that had once held nothing but warmth for him. Now they burned with frustration, hurt lurking just beneath the surface. "You missed the doctor's appointment." Again. Her voice was steady, but Richard caught the slight tremor, the barely contained emotion threatening to spill over. He sighed, setting down his cup. "Alina, I told you, I had a crucial meeting. The Morrison deal." She finished for him, her voice sharper now. "Yes, I know. Your empire is always expanding, Richard. But what about us? What about the promises you made?" Richard leaned back, his mask of indifference slipping into place. "Alina, we've been through this." "No, you have been through this," she shot back, crossing her arms. "I've been alone in this marriage for years, watching you prioritize everything but us." Richard exhaled heavily. He was used to negotiations, to breaking down resistance with logic and power plays. But Alina, she had a way of cutting straight to his core. "I'm building this for us," he tried again. "For our future." Her laugh was hollow, devoid of any real amusement. "Our future," she echoed. Then she took a step forward, her expression softening, but her voice, when it came, was like a hammer blow. "Richard, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, altering the very gravity of the room. A slow, suffocating silence followed. Alina watched him carefully, as if waiting for something, anything, that would indicate he felt the weight of what she had just revealed. Richard knew. Of course he knew. She had told him months ago, had even placed his hand over the slight curve of her stomach, once in an attempt to bridge the ever-growing distance between them. But hearing her say it aloud now, standing before him with those pleading eyes, made it inescapable. "We're having a baby in 3 months," she said, voice cracking slightly. And you haven't been there for a single appointment. Not one. Richard swallowed, his mind calculating, grasping for the right words. He had built a life where control was absolute, where he dictated the terms. But here, in this moment, he felt powerless. Elena. His phone buzzed on the desk. A text flashed across the screen. News of a potential hostile takeover. Reflexively, instinctively, his hand moved to pick it up. Elena's face crumpled. She let out a shaky breath, then turned towards the door. "Of course," she whispered. "Of course you have to take that call." "Elena, wait," Richard started, but she was already gone. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, he just sat there, staring at the empty space where she had been. A war raged inside him. His empire was everything. He had fought, bled, sacrificed to build it. How could he slow down now? How could he step away from the battlefield when the stakes were so high? But the image of Elena's tear-filled eyes, the curve of her stomach, the weight of all he had already lost, clashed against the empire he had given his soul to. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push the emotions aside. He had a deal to close, a company to protect. The rest would have to wait. Later that night, the office was nearly empty, save for the distant hum of the cleaning staff. Richard sat at his desk, tie loosened, a half-finished drink in his hand. The city stretched before him in glittering lights, a kingdom he had conquered. But for the first time, it didn't feel like enough. A gentle knock on the door startled him. He glanced up, expecting his assistant, but found Maria instead, the elderly cleaning woman who had worked in the building for as long as he could remember. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice kind but firm. "It's past midnight. Shouldn't you be home?" Richard exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "I have work to finish." Maria stepped closer, peering at him over her glasses. "The work will still be here tomorrow. But your child is growing every day." Richard stiffened, caught off guard by the directness of her words. "I know how to build empires, Maria," he admitted, his voice uncharacteristically raw. "I know how to win. But a family, a child. What if I'm not cut out for this?" Maria smiled gently, setting down her cleaning cloth. "The fact that you're asking that question tells me you care more than you think." She turned to leave, but before she did, she paused. "Mr. Calloway, at the end of your life, you won't wish you'd spent more time in this office, but you will regret every moment you missed with your family." As the door closed behind her, Richard sat frozen, the drink in his hand forgotten. His phone buzzed again. Another deal, another negotiation. His fingers hovered over the screen. But this time, he hesitated. For the first time in his life, Richard Calloway, the master strategist, the empire builder, was at a crossroads. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which path to take. The road not taken. 3 months later, Richard Calloway had built his life on movement. Constant, unrelenting, forward motion. Success was not a destination for him. It was a game of endurance, a battle where only the strong survived. And he was the strongest. Until now. Until the moment he stood at the glass doors of Mount Sinai Hospital, staring at the text message from his assistant. "It's a boy." Elena delivered at 2:38 a.m. "Mother and child are healthy." The words should have filled him with triumph, with joy. Instead, they felt like a punch to the gut. Because he wasn't there. He hadn't been there for the contractions, for the anxious pacing in the delivery room, for the moment his son had taken his first breath. Instead, he had been in London, locked in a tense negotiation that had added another $1 billion to his portfolio. But what was another billion to a man who had just missed the most important moment of his life? Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face before pushing through the hospital doors. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the low murmur of voices assaulted his senses as he approached the front desk. "I'm here for Elena Calloway," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The nurse glanced up, her expression shifting when she recognized his name. "She's in room 312. He nodded, heading down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. With every step, doubt crept into his mind. Would she even want to see him? When he reached the door, he hesitated. From inside, he heard soft murmuring, the quiet coos of a newborn, and the gentle hum of Elena's voice. His heart clenched. Then, steeling himself, he pushed open the door. A mother's resolve. Elena was sitting up in bed, her auburn hair tousled, dark circles under her eyes. But she had never looked more beautiful to him. She cradled a small, swaddled figure in her arms, her expression one of pure adoration. When she looked up and saw him, the warmth disappeared, replaced by something colder, something guarded. "Richard," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. His throat felt dry. "Elena." An awkward silence settled between them. The beeping of the heart monitor, the distant shuffle of nurses in the hallway, every sound seemed amplified. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Richard took a step forward, his eyes locking onto the small bundle in Elena's arms. "Is he?" His voice faltered, betraying the nerves he had so carefully concealed. Elena studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, this is your son." Richard's breath hitched. His son. The words felt foreign, unreal. Elena sighed, adjusting the tiny cap on the baby's head. "His name is Thomas." Thomas. The name settled in Richard's chest like an anchor, heavier than any business deal, more powerful than any empire he had ever built. "Can I?" He gestured toward the baby, his hands uncharacteristically unsteady. For a moment, he thought she would refuse. But then, with great reluctance, she nodded. Carefully, as if holding the most fragile thing in the world, Richard reached out. Elena placed the baby in his arms, and for the first time in his life, he felt utterly unprepared. Thomas was impossibly small, his tiny fists curled, his breath soft and even. Richard had commanded boardrooms, faced down billionaires, controlled the ebb and flow of entire industries. But this, holding his son, it was the most terrifying thing he had ever done. As he gazed down at the sleeping infant, something inside him shifted, breaking open in a way he hadn't expected. This was real. This was his son. "Hey, little guy," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm your dad." Elena watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. "You weren't here, Richard," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "For months, you weren't here. And when I went into labor, you were thousands of miles away, closing a deal." Richard flinched. "I know," he admitted. "I know I should have been here." "Then why weren't you?" The question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even angry. It was worse. It was tired. Richard swallowed hard. He could give her the usual excuses, his responsibilities, the pressures of his position, but none of them would be enough. None of them would erase the fact that he had chosen his empire over his family. "I was afraid," he admitted finally. Elena blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. "I know how to build companies, how to negotiate deals, how to control everything around me. But this," he glanced down at Thomas, "this is something I don't know how to do. And I thought if I just kept working, if I just provided for you both, then maybe that would be enough." Elena let out a slow breath, her gaze softening just a fraction. "But it's not." "No," he said quietly. "It's not." A long silence stretched between them. Richard didn't know what he expected her to say, but when she finally spoke, it wasn't anger or bitterness that laced her words, it was resignation. "I don't know if we can fix this, Richard," she admitted. "I don't know if I can trust you again." Richard's stomach twisted. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," he said, gripping Thomas just a little tighter. "But I want to try, if you'll let me." Elena studied him for what felt like an eternity before she finally sighed. "For Thomas's sake," she said, her voice softer now. "We can try. But Richard, if you walk away again, If you choose your work over him even once, I won't let you back in." Her words carried the weight of an ultimatum, but Richard didn't flinch. This was it, the crossroads. And for the first time, he knew exactly which path he needed to take. A promise made. The following weeks were an adjustment, both for Richard and for Elena. He stayed in New York, taking a step back from the whirlwind of corporate demands. He visited daily, learning how to hold Thomas properly, how to change diapers, poorly at first, how to soothe his son's cries. It was humbling. It was terrifying. And it was the most important work he had ever done. But trust was a fragile thing. He could see the way Elena watched him, the way she waited for him to falter, to retreat back into the safety of his empire. He didn't. One evening, as he rocked Thomas to sleep, Elena leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're really staying," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Richard looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yeah," he said softly, "I am." She nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "His christening is in 2 weeks. My family will be there. They don't exactly have the highest opinion of you." Richard exhaled, already bracing for the storm ahead. "I wouldn't blame them." Elena studied him for a long moment, then let out a small sigh. Maybe it's time they got to know the man who's trying to make things right. Richard nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at the stock market, or the next big acquisition, or the newest skyscraper bearing his name. He was looking at his son, and he was finally home. Bridges and barriers. A new reality. Richard Calloway had spent years carving out a legacy in the corporate world, but now he was attempting to build something much more delicate. His family. It had been 4 weeks since Thomas's birth, and in that time, Richard had done something entirely foreign to him. He had stepped back from his empire. His executives were in a frenzy over his absence, his board was unsettled, and his competitors were circling like vultures. Yet none of it mattered as much as the tiny boy who now ruled his world. Richard adjusted the blanket around Thomas, who was nestled against his chest, his tiny fingers gripping Richard's shirt. In the past, his mornings had been filled with conference calls and negotiations. Now, they started with diapers, bottles, and the quiet hum of lullabies. It was the hardest transition of his life, and yet, somehow, the most rewarding. "You're getting the hang of it," Elena murmured from the doorway, watching as Richard carefully shifted Thomas into his crib. Richard exhaled, his hands lingering for a moment as he gazed down at his son. "It's different," he admitted. "Every day I realize how much I don't know." Elena stepped into the nursery, crossing her arms. "Babies don't come with instruction manuals," she said. "You just learn as you go." Richard turned to face her, searching for any sign that he was making progress, not just with Thomas, but with her. "Am I doing okay?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Elena hesitated. The walls between them hadn't fallen completely, but she couldn't deny that Richard had been trying. He showed up every day. He fed Thomas, changed him, read to him. She wanted to believe he was different. But history had taught her to be careful with Richard Calloway. "You're doing better than I expected," she admitted. "But Richard, showing up now doesn't erase the past. It doesn't fix what you broke." Richard nodded. "I know," he said quietly. "But I want to fix it." Elena sighed, rubbing her arms as if to ward off the cold. "I want to believe you," she said, meeting his eyes. "But it's not that simple. And it's not just my trust you have to earn. My family, my friends, none of them have forgotten how you left." Richard clenched his jaw. He had anticipated this, but hearing it still cut deep. "Then tell me what I need to do," he said, his voice laced with quiet desperation. "Tell me how to prove that I'm here to stay." Elena studied him for a long moment, then spoke. "Come to the christening." Richard blinked, caught off guard. "Of course, I was already planning to." Elena shook her head. "I mean really come, Richard. not just as Thomas's father, but as someone willing to face the people who think you don't deserve a second chance. Richard swallowed. Your family hates me. They don't hate you, Alina said, but they don't trust you. And if you're serious about this, about us, you have to show them that you're not going to disappear again. Richard exhaled, nodding slowly. He had closed million-dollar deals, stood in front of press conferences, and dominated boardrooms. But this, facing Alina's family, it felt like walking into the lion's den. And yet, for the first time in his life, he was willing to do it. A reckoning at the christening. The church was smaller than Richard had expected. He had offered to pay for a grand venue, but Alina had refused. This isn't about appearances, she had told him. It's about family. Richard adjusted his tie as he walked up the steps, feeling the weight of a dozen stairs. Alina's family was already gathered inside, speaking in hushed voices. As soon as he stepped through the doors, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Alina's father, James Mercer, was the first to approach. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were hard. Richard, he said, his voice clipped, didn't expect you to show. Richard held his ground. I wouldn't miss it. James studied him, then scoffed. Funny, considering you missed everything else. A sharp tension settled over the room. Richard's instincts told him to deflect, to control the situation. But this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a negotiation. This was about his son. I deserve that, Richard admitted. I made mistakes, but I'm here now. James narrowed his eyes. And how long before you get bored and run back to your empire? Alina, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward. Dad, she said, her tone firm. Enough. James hesitated but backed off, muttering under his breath. Alina's sister, Sarah, approached next, arms crossed. You hurt her, she said bluntly. For years, I watched Alina cry herself to sleep, wondering why she wasn't enough for you. And now you just show up and expect a second chance. Richard clenched his fists. No, I don't expect anything, he said. But I love my son, and I love Alina. I'm not leaving again. Sarah searched his face, looking for deception. When she found none, she let out a sharp breath. For Alina's sake, I hope you mean that. The ceremony itself was a blur. Richard sat beside Alina, watching as the priest blessed Thomas, feeling an overwhelming sense of something he couldn't quite name. Was it peace? Regret? Hope? Maybe all three. After the service, as guests mingled, Alina pulled Richard aside. You did well, she admitted. Richard smirked. You sound surprised. She exhaled a laugh, but her eyes softened. I am. For the first time in years, there was something between them that felt familiar, like the warmth they had once shared hadn't entirely burned out. Alina, he started, voice low. Do you think? Mommy. Thomas's tiny voice interrupted, and they both turned to see their son toddling towards them, his chubby hands reaching out. Richard bent down, scooping him up with a grin. Hey, buddy. Thomas clapped his hands excitedly. You stayed. Richard's breath caught. Such a simple statement. And yet, it meant everything. Alina looked at Richard, her eyes glistening with something unspoken. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. An unwelcome disruption. That night, Richard sat in his penthouse, looking at a folder on his desk. It was the resignation paperwork his board had sent him. They wanted him gone. The scandal of his departure, combined with his absence, had weakened his position. His phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. Urgent meeting. Board is moving to force you out completely. Richard clenched his jaw. The past few weeks had been the first time in years that he had felt alive, that he had felt like he was choosing something meaningful. But if he lost everything, his company, his fortune, could he still be the man Alina and Thomas needed? As he debated, the doorbell rang. Frowning, he opened it. A woman stood there, blonde, confident, dressed in a sharp business suit. "Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly, extending a hand. "I represent a group of investors who would like to offer you a deal." Richard hesitated. "I'm not interested." She smirked. "I think you will be. We can help you take back your empire." Richard stiffened. He had made his choice, family over business. But now, the past was coming for him, and he wasn't sure if he could outrun it. Shadows of the past. A tempting offer. Richard Calloway had spent years mastering the art of control. Every decision he made was precise, calculated. But standing at the threshold of his penthouse, staring at the woman who had just offered him a way back into his empire, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. The woman, Naomi Whitmore, was a powerhouse in the investment world. Ruthless, strategic, and always a step ahead. The kind of person Richard would have once admired. Now she was the kind of person who threatened everything he had worked for these past few months. "You must have the wrong impression," Richard said smoothly, stepping aside to let her in but keeping his expression unreadable. "I'm not looking to get my company back." Naomi arched a perfectly manicured brow. "Aren't you?" She strode inside like she owned the place, her heels clicking against the marble floors. "Your board thinks they've won, Richard. They think they can push you out and erase your legacy. I know that doesn't sit well with you." Richard clenched his jaw. It didn't sit well, but he had made his choice, his family over his empire. He couldn't let himself be pulled back in. "You didn't come here just to remind me I'm being replaced," he said, folding his arms. "What do you want?" Naomi's red lips curved into a smirk. "I represent a group of investors who believe Calloway Industries isn't the same without its founder. We want to put you back where you belong." Richard let out a slow breath. This was a test, a moment where he had to decide, once and for all, if he was willing to let go of the world he had built for the sake of the life he was trying to rebuild. "Why would I take this deal?" he asked. "I have nothing to prove to that board." Naomi chuckled, shaking her head. "Don't play coy, Richard. You built that empire with your bare hands. Do you really think you can just walk away and be, what, a stay-at-home dad?" She gestured around his penthouse, her gaze sharp. "You may think you've changed, but men like you don't just stop wanting to win." Richard's fingers curled into fists at his sides. The temptation was there, like an old addiction whispering in his ear. The power, the control, the ability to shape entire industries. It had been his lifeblood for so long. But when he closed his eyes, he didn't see a boardroom. He saw Thomas's wide, trusting eyes. He saw Alina's cautious but hopeful smile. "You're wrong," he said finally, his voice firm. "I'm not that man anymore." Naomi sighed, as if disappointed. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, placing it on his table. "Take some time to think about it," she said, "but don't take too long. Because once you're out for good, there's no coming back." With that, she turned on her heel and walked out. Richard stood there for a long moment, staring at the folder on his desk. And then, in one swift motion, he grabbed it and tossed it into the fireplace. He had made his choice, and for the first time, he wasn't looking back. Alina's doubts. The next morning, Richard arrived at Alina's apartment early. Thomas was already awake, running around the living room in his superhero pajamas, a plastic cape flapping behind him. "Daddy," Thomas squealed, racing toward him. Richard scooped him up, feeling the warmth spread through his chest as the little boy clung to him. "Hey, buddy," Richard said, ruffling his son's hair. "Ready for some breakfast?" "Pancakes," Thomas declared. Richard glanced over at Alina, who was standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee. She gave him a small, unreadable smile. "Want some?" she asked, holding up the pot. "Yeah," he said, setting Thomas down. "Thanks." As Alina handed him a mug, she studied him carefully. "You're quiet today." Richard exhaled. "Had an unexpected visitor last night." Alina arched a brow. "Let me guess. Someone from your company." He nodded. They want me to fight to get my position back. Alina set down her coffee cup a little too hard. And what did you tell them? Richard held her gaze. That I wasn't interested. Something flickered in her expression. Relief, maybe, or skepticism. Are you sure about that? She asked. Richard frowned. Of course I am. Alina bit her lip, choosing her next words carefully. It's just, I know how much that company meant to you, Richard, and I don't want you to resent me or Thomas for choosing to walk away. Richard set his coffee down and reached for her hand. Alina, listen to me. I spent years chasing success because I thought it would fill the emptiness inside me. But I was wrong. It was never about the money or the power. It was about feeling like I mattered. Alina swallowed, her grip on his hand tightening. And you do matter, she said softly. Richard nodded. I know that now, but not because of my company. Because of you. Because of Thomas. Alina searched his face for any sign of hesitation. Finally, she let out a slow breath and nodded. Okay, she whispered. For the first time in years, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The board's last move. Just when Richard thought he had put his past behind him, his phone rang. He almost ignored it, but when he saw the caller ID, his stomach tightened. It was his lawyer. Richard, the voice on the other end said grimly, "We have a problem." Richard stepped away from the kitchen, lowering his voice. What kind of problem? The board isn't just forcing you out. They're going after your shares. They want to cut you off completely. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. They can't do that. They can if they claim negligence, the lawyer said. They're arguing that you've abandoned your position and are unfit to continue as a shareholder. Richard felt his pulse quicken. He had walked away willingly, but to be pushed out completely, to have everything he built taken from him. No, that was something else entirely. What are my options? He asked. The lawyer hesitated. You could fight them, but it would get ugly. Richard clenched his jaw. Fighting back meant stepping into the world he had left behind. It meant proving he still had power, that he could still command the respect of the business world. But it also meant something more dangerous. It meant proving Naomi right. Daddy? Thomas's small voice made Richard turn. His son was standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Richard exhaled slowly. Let them have it, he said into the phone. I'm done. The silence on the other end was heavy. Are you sure about this? The lawyer asked. Richard looked at his son. Yeah, he said softly. I'm sure. When he hung up, Thomas tugged at his hand. Can we play now, Daddy? Richard knelt down, pulling Thomas into a tight hug. Yeah, buddy, he said. We can play. For the first time, he wasn't the CEO of Callaway Industries. He wasn't the billionaire businessman. He was just Dad, and it was the most important role of his life. The weight of letting go, the last goodbye to his empire. The next morning, Richard Callaway stood outside the towering headquarters of Callaway Industries, his empire. Except it wasn't his anymore. He had built this company from the ground up, shaping it into an untouchable powerhouse. He had sacrificed everything, his sleep, his relationships, his family, to stand at the top of the financial world. And now, after years of calling the shots, he was about to walk into that building for the last time. Security let him through with a mixture of hesitation and respect, their eyes shifting between him and the large digital stock ticker scrolling overhead. It still bore his name, Callaway Industries, but after today, it would belong to someone else. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual. Each ding of the floor's passing made his pulse quicken. He wasn't nervous. No, that wasn't it. It was something worse. It was grief. As the doors opened, Richard stepped into the executive wing, his polished shoes clicking against the pristine marble floor. His office door was already ajar. He pushed it open to find 3 members of the board sitting inside, already waiting for him like wolves circling a wounded lion. Naomi Whitmore was one of them. She sat at the head of the table, perfectly poised, her expression unreadable. To her right was Edwin Lancaster, an old-money businessman who had once been Richard's greatest supporter, until he wasn't. And across from them was Dean Wexler, a financial strategist who had built his career on exploiting power shifts like the one about to unfold. "Richard," Naomi greeted, standing up. "I was hoping you'd come." Richard let out a short breath and closed the door behind him. "Let's get this over with." Naomi exchanged a glance with Edwin before nodding. "We'll keep this brief. As you know, the board has voted to remove you from any controlling interests in Callaway Industries." "I know," Richard said, voice measured. "And I'm here to sign the papers." Edwin smirked. "Just like that?" Richard met his gaze without blinking. Just like that. He watched as a flicker of disappointment crossed Naomi's face. She had expected resistance. She had wanted him to fight. But Richard wasn't giving her that satisfaction. Naomi pushed the documents toward him. "Then sign." Richard glanced down at the papers. The last document had his name printed at the bottom. Final resignation and shareholder forfeiture agreement. The ink felt heavy beneath his fingertips. He picked up the pen. Paused. This wasn't just a signature. It was the end of an era. His legacy. His empire. His life's work. And yet, as he looked at those names, Naomi Whitmore, Edwin Lancaster, Dean Wexler, he realized something profound. He didn't belong here anymore. This wasn't his world. His world was back in Elena's apartment, where his son waited for him to come home. Richard took a deep breath and signed his name. As soon as the pen left the paper, something inside him shifted. Not regret. Relief. He slid the folder back across the table. "It's done." Naomi studied him, as if searching for any sign of hesitation. "You're making a mistake, Richard." "No," he said, standing. "For the first time in my life, I'm not." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, out of the office, out of the building, out of his past. Rebuilding what matters. That afternoon, Richard found himself back at Elena's apartment, knocking softly on the door. She opened it cautiously, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're early." "Yeah," Richard said. "I wanted to be." Elena studied him, searching his face for something. "So?" He let out a slow breath. "It's over." Her brow furrowed. "You mean?" "I walked away," he confirmed. "Signed the papers. I'm not part of Callaway Industries anymore." Elena's lips parted slightly in shock. "You actually did it." Richard nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Yeah. And you know what? It feels right." She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. "So what now?" Richard exhaled. "Now, I figure out how to do this. How to be a real father to Thomas. How to..." He hesitated. Elena tilted her head. "How to what?" Richard met her eyes. "How to be the man you used to believe in." Elena's breath hitched, but she didn't look away. Just then, Thomas's voice rang out from inside the apartment. "Mommy, where's Daddy?" Richard swallowed hard. He had never been anyone's dad before. He had been a CEO, a mogul, a businessman. But Dad. "Come in," Elena said softly, stepping aside. Richard hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. Thomas was sitting on the floor, surrounded by toys, but as soon as he saw Richard, his entire face lit up. "Daddy." He ran to Richard at full speed, nearly knocking him over as he launched himself into his arms. Richard caught him, holding him tightly. And in that moment, standing in the middle of Elena's modest apartment, with his son's arms wrapped around him, Richard Callaway, former tycoon, former empire builder, realized something. This was his real legacy. Not skyscrapers, not billion-dollar deals. His son, his family. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he was losing anything. He felt like he had finally won. The price of redemption. A new beginning. For the first time in over a decade, Richard Calloway woke up without an empire to run. The weight that had been crushing him for years was suddenly gone. Instead of waking up to urgent emails and stock reports, he woke up to the sound of Thomas giggling from the other room. Instead of rushing into an office filled with tension and multimillion-dollar deals, he walked into a kitchen where the biggest concern was whether Thomas wanted pancakes or waffles. It was strange, unfamiliar, and yet it felt right. Elena was already at the stove, flipping pancakes. She looked over her shoulder as he entered, raising an eyebrow. "Didn't think you'd be up this early." Richard smirked, leaning against the counter. "Thought I'd try this whole normal morning thing." "Big step for you," she teased. Thomas, still in his pajamas, sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs back and forth. "Daddy, I get 2 pancakes today because I finished my broccoli last night." Richard chuckled. "That's a fair deal, buddy." Elena set a plate in front of Thomas, then turned back to the stove. Richard took a moment to admire how effortlessly she had built this world for their son, a world filled with warmth and love. A world without him. And that was the problem, wasn't it? He was trying to be part of this life now, but there were still cracks between him and Elena. The wounds of the past hadn't completely healed. She had let him in, but she hadn't let him back. Richard knew that if he wanted to fix what he had broken, he had to go all in. One last conversation with the past. Later that day, Richard stood in front of a gravestone, hands shoved into his pockets. His father's name was carved into the marble, simple and unadorned. William Calloway, the man who had taught him everything about survival and ambition, and nothing about love. Richard had spent his whole life running from his father's mistakes, only to repeat them in his own way. "I get it now," Richard murmured, staring at the name on the stone. "I always thought you were just a man who didn't care. But maybe you did care. Maybe you just didn't know how to show it." A breeze rustled the trees, carrying his words into the sky. "I don't want to be like you," Richard continued. "I don't want my son to grow up the way I did, always wondering why his father was never really there." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So I'm done chasing ghosts. I'm done trying to prove something to a man who isn't even here anymore." He turned to leave but hesitated. "Goodbye, Dad," he said, his voice steadier now. "For real this time." And with that, Richard walked away from his past, toward the future he was finally ready to build. A businessman without a business. A week had passed since Richard officially stepped down from Calloway Industries. At first, the media had been relentless, spinning stories about his downfall, about how he had abandoned his empire. But as the headlines shifted to new scandals, Richard found himself fading from public interest, which was exactly what he wanted. He spent his days with Thomas, picking him up from press school, taking him to the park, helping him build Lego towers that always collapsed. It was everything Richard had never imagined for himself. But the restlessness still lingered. One afternoon, as he was helping Thomas put on his superhero cape, Elena walked in from the kitchen, crossing her arms. "So," she said, "have you given any thought to what you're going to do next?" Richard glanced up. "Besides perfecting my pancake-making skills." Elena smirked. "Yes, besides that." He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know. It's weird. For so long my job was my identity. Now without it." He shook his head. "I guess I need to figure out who I am outside of Calloway Industries." Elena watched him carefully. "You built one empire, Richard. You can build something new." Richard studied her. "Would you want that?" She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Would you want me to go back to that world?" he asked. "Or would you rather I just stay like this?" Elena hesitated. "I don't want you to change who you are, Richard, but I do want you to learn balance. If you find something new, something that makes you happy, I'll support you, as long as it doesn't come at the expense of our son." Richard nodded slowly. "Fair enough." She studied him for a moment longer before turning back to the kitchen. But before she left the room, she added softly, I meant what I said, you know. You're a builder. You just need to figure out what's worth building now. Richard sat there, her words ringing in his head. What was worth building? He had a feeling he was about to find out. An unexpected opportunity. A few days later, Richard received a call. Calloway, he answered, expecting it to be another journalist looking for a quote. Instead, a familiar voice greeted him. Mr. Calloway, it's Mark Hewitt. We met years ago at the Young Entrepreneurs Summit. Richard frowned. Mark. Yeah, I remember. You were the kid trying to revolutionize online retail. Mark laughed. Still trying. But that's actually why I'm calling. I heard you stepped away from Calloway Industries. Richard raised an eyebrow. Word travels fast. I have a proposition, Mark continued. I'm launching a startup. It's small, but we're growing fast. I need someone with your experience. Someone who knows how to scale a business the right way. Not just for profits, but for longevity. Richard hesitated. I'm not looking to run another corporation. You wouldn't be, Mark assured him. I don't need a CEO. I need a mentor, a strategist, someone who can help shape the vision, not get lost in the grind. You'd still have time for your family. That last part hit Richard harder than he expected. This wasn't a takeover. It wasn't a billion-dollar empire. It was something new. Something balanced. Let me think about it, Richard finally said. Take your time, Mark replied. But I think you already know the answer. The conversation that changed everything. That night, Richard sat across from Elena on her apartment balcony. I got an offer today, he told her. Elena tilted her head. Oh, a startup, he explained. They want me to be an advisor, not a CEO, just someone to guide them. She studied him. And I think I'd want to do it, Richard admitted. It's not about power or money. It's about building something. The right way this time. Elena exhaled, a slow smile creeping onto her lips. I think that sounds perfect for you. Richard reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Elena, I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't change the past. But I can change the future. I want to be in this with you, not just for Thomas. For us. Elena swallowed hard. Richard, I'm not asking for everything overnight, he said quickly. I just want to know if there's still a chance. Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with a storm of emotions. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she squeezed his hand. Maybe, she whispered. Maybe there is. Richard felt his heart tighten. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, either. And for the first time in his life, he was okay with that. Because for the first time, he wasn't chasing the future. He was building it. One day at a time. A legacy rebuilt. A life worth fighting for. Richard Calloway had once been a man defined by ambition, by the numbers on a spreadsheet, by the stocks that bore his name. Now he was defined by something else entirely, by the small, paint-covered hand that tugged on his sleeve. Daddy, Thomas said, his voice full of urgency, I made you a picture. Richard looked up from the business proposal he had been reviewing at Elena's kitchen table and found himself face to face with a masterpiece of crayon artistry. The drawing was of a house, tall and sturdy, with 3 stick figures standing in front. One had long hair, Elena. One had messy curls, Thomas. And the last figure, standing between them, his arms stretched protectively around them, was Richard. Something tightened in his chest. He had spent his entire career building something grand, something he thought would last forever. But this was the only thing that truly mattered. It's perfect, buddy, Richard murmured, ruffling Thomas's curls. I'll put it on my wall. Thomas beamed. Elena, who had been watching quietly from the other side of the room, folded her arms, her lips curving into a soft smile. You're different, she observed. Richard glanced at her. Good different. She exhaled, studying him. I think so. She still wasn't saying yes. But she wasn't saying no either. And that gave him hope. Stepping into the future, a few days later, Richard stood in front of a sleek, glass-walled office in Brooklyn, taking in the sight of what could be his next chapter. The company Mark Hewitt had built was nothing like Callaway Industries. There were no marble floors, no gold nameplates, no power-hungry executives vying for dominance. Instead, there were young minds, fresh ideas, and a hunger to change the world, not just make money. Richard stepped inside, shaking hands with Mark. "Glad you made it," Mark said, grinning. "Ready to do something different?" Richard smirked. "Let's see if I still remember how to build something from the ground up." He wasn't in charge this time. And for once, that was exactly what he wanted. A bridge between the past and the present. As the weeks passed, Richard found himself settling into his new role, not just at the company, but in Thomas's life. He was the one who took him to press school in the mornings. He was the one who taught him how to tie his shoes, though Thomas still preferred his superhero Velcro sneakers. He was the one who sat at the dinner table with Alina and their son, feeling like he belonged for the first time in years. But there were still barriers between him and Alina. She was cautious, careful, protecting herself from disappointment. And Richard knew that if he wanted to earn her trust completely, he had to prove that this time he wasn't going anywhere. The moment that changed everything. One evening, as Richard walked into Alina's apartment, he heard soft sniffles coming from Thomas's room. Concerned, he pushed open the door. Thomas was sitting on his bed, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur, his lower lip trembling. "Hey, buddy," Richard said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "What's wrong?" Thomas hesitated, then whispered, "Are you leaving again?" The question punched Richard in the gut. He swallowed hard. "No, Thomas, I'm not." "But you did leave," Thomas mumbled, rubbing at his eyes. "Before I was born. Mommy says you were gone for a long time." Richard's throat tightened. "I was, and I was wrong to leave. But I promise you, I will never leave again." Thomas looked up at him, his small brow furrowed. "Pinky promise." Richard held out his pinky. "Pinky promise." Thomas hesitated for only a second before linking his tiny pinky with Richard's. And just like that, Richard knew this was the most important deal he had ever made. The conversation that changed it all. That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep, Richard found Alina standing by the window, lost in thought. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. She glanced at him. "Sure. Do you think you'll ever trust me again?" Alina exhaled, rubbing her arms. "I want to," she admitted, "but it's hard. Every time I start to believe in us, I remember what it felt like when you walked away." Richard swallowed hard. "I can't change what I did, but I can prove to you that I've changed." She turned to face him fully, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. "I don't just want you to be a good father, Richard," she said. "I need to know that if we try again, you won't run when things get hard. I need to know that you're in this, completely." Richard stepped closer. "I am," he said, voice steady. "I was lost before, Alina. I thought success meant power and money. But it doesn't. It means this. You, Thomas, us, and I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that I know that now." Alina's eyes shimmered with emotion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached for his hand. Richard's heart pounded as her fingers curled around his. It wasn't an answer, but it was a beginning. A proposal, but not the kind you think. A month later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Richard stood outside a small house with a for sale sign planted in the yard. Alina frowned, crossing her arms. "What is this?" Richard smiled, holding up a key. "Our new beginning." Alina's breath caught. "Richard, you said you wanted to believe in us again," he said softly. "This isn't just about me moving closer. It's about me choosing to build a life with you and Thomas." Alina stared at him, her eyes full of emotions he couldn't quite read. "I don't need an answer today," Richard continued. "I just need you to know that I want this, that I'm here for this, for us." Helena let out a shaky breath. Then, to his shock, she reached out and took the key. "You're really serious about this," she murmured. "Completely." Helena studied him for a long moment. And then, finally, she smiled. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's give it a shot." Richard's chest tightened. This was it. Not the end of their story. The beginning of something new. A life worth building. Together. Epilogue. A different kind of legacy. 1 year later, Richard stood in the backyard of the home he had bought for his family, watching as Thomas ran through the grass with his superhero cape trailing behind him. "Daddy," Thomas called. "Come play." Richard grinned. "I'm coming, buddy." As he jogged toward his son, he caught sight of Helena on the porch, watching them with a soft, content smile. He met her gaze. She nodded. And in that simple gesture, Richard Calloway knew he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not power, not control, not money, but home. And he wasn't leaving this time. Not for anything.